Anyway, so after the flood, what's interesting is that even from a secular perspective, based on genetics, on mitochondrial DNA, you're looking at a worldwide map of how everybody's related to everybody in the world. And it looks like that everybody came from either North Africa or the Middle East, which is pretty close to where we think Noah landed, the mountains of Ararat in Turkey. And so genetically speaking, it all seems to parallel what the Bible says, that everybody, and animals and humans, genetically spread out from this region and covered the globe. So it's like, that's kind of interesting. Mitochondrial DNA migrations seem to support the Bible story. What's interesting, though, and I try to talk to people about this who are secular or believe in evolution, is like they make fun of Noah's flood and the whole Genesis account, and after the flood, they're like, how in the world could a turtle walk around the world, right, in such a short time? It would take millions of years. So no, it wouldn't. It's like, if you think that after the flood there were kind of land bridges everywhere between all the continents, the world isn't really that big of a place. The circumference of the Earth is about 25,000 miles, so about 12,500 miles if you go halfway around, right, either direction. And so a turtle really would only have to walk about a mile per month, or migrate about a mile per month, and even a turtle can do that. It'd only take about 1,000 years to reach all the way around the globe at that rate. So even a slug can do that. It's like it doesn't take much to do it. So eventually, not too fast, not too long, all the animals could populate the world from a single location. And what happened is that during the flood and immediately after, the continents started separating, and there was this warm period of time, and there were land bridges probably during this time as well, where the animals not only migrated rapidly, but also reproduced very rapidly. Probably 400 or 500 years after the flood, it was warm, very warm, from all the energy that was released by the energy of the flood and the separation of continents. It really warmed up the oceans and all the volcanoes and everything. And so it was a period of a warm period for a long time. And enough to make millions of mammoths and other animals all around the Arctic Circle. It was grasslands, it was tundra, there were big trees, fruit-bearing trees. It was a very different world even right after the flood than it is now. And then the continents separated like this. You can see how they used to fit together. South America and Africa especially look like a jigsaw puzzle. What's interesting about animals, though, in these different places is that here we have a camel in Africa, and then we have a llama in South America. And it's like these are classified as different species, but they're really the same kind. Like, I like how the Bible describes kinds of animals. These are the same kinds of animals because they can still mate even today and produce viable, fertile offspring called a cama. Llama and a camel can make a cama. And in fact, in North America, here in North America, there were camels. They just died out here in North America. So these are not different kinds of animals. They're actually the same species or the same gene pool, and they can still reproduce and produce viable offspring. What's interesting too is that this genetically, again, in this paper published in 2018, Stockel and Thaler, they said almost all animal species on the earth today emerged about the same time as humans. This conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. Why would they say they fought against it? Because it's completely non-predictable from an evolutionary perspective or a naturalistic perspective, but it makes great sense from a creationist perspective or even a biblical perspective. They say this division or this arrival of all animals and humans at the same time happened 100,000 years ago. But that 100,000 year number is based on the evolutionary relationship between humans and apes. However, if you look at human pedigree relationships, the mutation rate is actually 20 times higher than assumed in this paper. The real mutation rate is 20 times higher. So it turns out that in reality, all animals and humans appeared on this planet from a common ancestor at the same time, about 3,000 to 6,000 years ago. which now makes very good sense from a biblical perspective, right? So it's like, wow. So everything, and also these genetics of these different animals, especially different kinds of animals, are widely separated in sequence space. There's no evolutionary connection. They're completely distinct, and they showed up at the same time. It's like, whoa, that makes perfect sense from a Noachian flood perspective. Also, this warm age right after the flood. It was about 5 degrees warmer on average around the world, and which makes a big difference in colder areas. Like it would be a 17% increase in the average December temperature in the Arctic region. Without an ice cap, Canada and Siberia about 20 to 50 degrees warmer, while over the Arctic Ocean it would be 35 to 70 degrees warmer than it is today. So what does this mean? It means that Greenland was actually green during this time. And there are warm water mollusks that are found, the fossilized remains or old remains in the Arctic Circle that now live 750 miles south in the Mediterranean. Vertebrates and large trees, fruit-bearing trees, are all in this Arctic region. Also, peat bogs are in this region, and peat requires an average temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit to form. All in the Arctic region, the same places as Greenland, all the way around. Pine needles and other organic debris are found in the bottom of ice core drilling in Greenland also. So Greenland was actually green, not covered by ice sheets during this period of time. And all the Arctic Circle was green. In fact, fossil forests, all in the New Siberian Islands, all these driftwood from when the permafrost is melting, it releases ancient wood. And now it just covers these islands with this ancient fossilized, it's not fossilized, it's like real wood. It's what they use primarily to build their houses and stuff in Siberia, is this ancient wood that's being released from the permafrost as it's melting. You can see all these logs and everything that are being released along the Kolma River. This is in Siberia, northern Siberia on the coast. No trees like this grow, and there's even like fruit trees, like plum trees and stuff that are here being released as the ice is melting. And so, wow, all this place used to be green. It used to be warm and green, giant trees and fruit trees even that don't grow ever since. So what happened? Woolly mammoths got frozen all of a sudden within one season, as well as a lot of other animals, horses, lions, tigers, leopards, bears, antelope, camel, reindeer, giant beavers, musk sheep, musk ox, donkey, ibex, badgers, fossils, wolverine, everything you can imagine, bison, rabbits, lynx, temperate plants, all this stuff got frozen and preserved in one season together, and their remains are still there in Siberia. So this ice age happened all of a sudden, bam, and froze all these animals within a very short time, one season probably, and trapped them all there, millions and millions of animals in this, where it used to be warm, and suddenly it got cold and trapped them all there. And they're still there. They're still being found right now. In fact, one of the biggest exports of Siberia used to be ivory, because all these millions of mammoth tusks are all there. So it was a sudden cold snap and like 2 miles of ice over what is presently New York City. It just kind of froze everything. And what happened when all the water went into the ice is that the ocean's levels dropped hundreds of feet, 600, 700 feet lower than today, which made land bridges between like Russia and Alaska and North and South America. Everything, Australia, all the islands, the Philippines, they were all connected by land bridges. So that's how the animals made it over there during this time, especially when the ocean levels were much lower than today. Mediterranean basin was completely dry. There was no Mediterranean Ocean. It was all dry. It wasn't until water levels started rising that it filled up the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. So more pictures on that. This is what it looked like for probably 1,000 years during the, like in the Middle East and the Sahara Desert. They were all green during this time. There were giant lakes in the Sahara region with big trees and lots of animals and grasslands and everything. It was a very different place. It wasn't a desert. And the Middle East, Israel, region was actually a place flowing with milk and honey, just like the Bible says. So it was very different than it is today. So what's interesting about this from a secular perspective is that evidently all the evidence isn't considered by different groups of scientists at the same time. Because Greenland, the layers of ice in Greenland, they think that each of these layers that you see stacked up on top of each other represents an annual layer, like one layer per year. And so that if you count the layers, you can find out how old the ice is by counting the layers. Well, it turns out that in Greenland, that each of these layers actually doesn't represent a year, it represents a storm. And so you can have multiple storms during a given year of snowstorms, and they each make their own layer. So you can't really count the layers as you count tree rings, because it doesn't work that way. So what do? And also, as the layers go down and be compressed into ice, the ice layers, you can kind of see these bands of ice, and they also don't represent a year either for each layer. They represent multiple storms, let's say. It's much thicker in Greenland than it is in Antarctica, because Antarctica is like a cold desert. So Greenland is like a wet tropical, well, it's much wetter than Antarctica. And so the layers are much thicker, so you can count them more easily, like 10 times thicker. But as the ice goes down and gets compressed, it gets stretched out and it gets really thin. Each of these layers get really thin, like less than a millimeter thick. And so you become really thin, so thin that you can't see them visually anymore. So how do scientists count them and come up with this idea that they represent 160,000 years of ice? And here I can show you that back during the war, these B-17s landed on Greenland. And then when they were rediscovered in 1988, they were under 260 feet or 80 meters of ice with hundreds and hundreds of layers. So clearly they don't represent a layer per year. And they get thinned out. And here's how they date these things is based on different isotopes of oxygen, for example. And if you oxygen 18, since it's heavier, it's more common in the summertime, and oxygen 16, since it's lighter isotope, it's more common in the wintertime. So based on these bands of oxygen isotopes, you get these wiggle lines on the bottom here, and each wiggle is supposed to represent a year, because it's a cold spell and a warm spell, cold spell, cold period, warm period. So if you count the wiggle lines, they represent a year, and that's how they come up with the hundreds of thousands of years for these ice sheets based on these isotopes. There's a problem, though. The problem is that all these things move in ice. So back in 2001, Vince Sanchez published in Nature, and it was published elsewhere as well, chemicals trapped in ancient glacial ice or polar ice can move substantial distances within the ice, up to 50 centimeters in deep ice. 50 centimeters, and the layer's only millimeter or less thick, right? And if stuff can move 50 centimeters, what does that do to you being able to count the layers as far as the years are concerned? Completely messes that up. So he says that means that past analysis of historical climate changes gleaned from ice core samples might not be entirely accurate. And he's being gentle. Yeah, right? The point of this paper is to suggest that the ice core community go back and redo the chemistry, because it doesn't mean anything as far as dating these ice layers, as far as their ancient nature. In fact, they could have been deposited very rapidly to their current thickness within a few hundred years or even 1,000 years. Certainly, it doesn't require hundreds of thousands of years. And here's liquid water channels in the deep ice between ice grains in these ice cores, which moves things all over the place and jumbles everything up as far as these isotopes are concerned. Also, the deep ice core drills, they get to the bottom and they find mud, and in the mud there's plant material. There's like pine needles and leaves and other things, which they fail to carbon-14 date for some reason. They don't talk about. They could easily carbon-14 date them, but they don't, because they would come back like the age of mammoths and things like in the maybe 10 or 1,000 years, but certainly not hundreds of thousands of years old. Same thing with dinosaur remains. They date the same age as mammoths, like 10 to 20, up to 30,000 years old. They don't date in the millions of years. Also, right after the flood, since the water decreased in the oceans, way down hundreds of feet lower than it is today, there's giant canyons off the coasts of every continent. Huge canyons, bigger than the Grand Canyon. Here's one off Monterey Bay. It's a giant canyon. When the water ran off the continents, it created these erosion canyons. And it ran off rapidly, and it made these canyons rapidly. Here's another Hudson Bay Canyon. It was bigger than the Grand Canyon. And what's interesting about these things is that everybody talks about them like they're millions of years old, or it took millions of years of time to make these things. The same thing was thought about the scablands of Washington State. For a long time, the scientific community said that it took millions of years to create these features, until this guy, Harlan Bretz, came along and said, no, it looks like a flood made these things. And he was laughed to scorn, saying there's no way it could have been a flood, because everybody thought if it were a flood, then it could be Noah's flood, right? So he said, no, it was a flood, and then he went and he finally found the source of the flood. Turned out it was a giant lake in Canada that was blocked by an ice dam, and when the ice dam collapsed, it let all this water loose from this big lake, and it washed over Washington State and created these formations called the scablands. And so finally, eventually, they believed him because it wasn't Noah's flood. It was a local flood, so they finally believed. But it took him decades, like 30 years, to convince everybody that it really was a flood that created these features. But you can see giant ripple marks, and you can see these formations that look like islands in longitudinal section. So it clearly makes sense that it was a flood that made these. And if you look at it from space, you can see the channels, how the water went through Washington State and created all these things. And here's the big lake in Canada with the ice dam that got released and then released all the water and made the flood. Here's the ripple marks from space in Washington that you can see. And then they finally accepted him, and he became a great geologist in the scientific community, because of course he wasn't talking about Noah's flood after all. However, you can see the same features as you see in Washington State and the scablands all over the planet on a bigger scale. Like if you look at the Grand Canyon from space, you see that there's this V around it. The little line there in the middle, you can see this little line right in the middle of that V. I don't know if you can see the laser, you can't. But there's this V shape, and then there's a little line. That's very similar to the scablands in Washington State. But the little dark line in the middle, that's the Grand Canyon. The big V there, that's the Grand Staircase. So what happened is there's beyond Lake Powell, there was this big lake, this giant, huge inland lake, way bigger than the Great Lakes that are in the United States. And an exit collapsed. This giant sheet of water got released, and it eroded that V. It just got released in a giant sheet, and it went over that Grand Staircase area, and it eroded backward into that V shape until all the water went away. And then what was left created the Grand Canyon. And it didn't create all the Grand Canyon. Like the Western Grand Canyon, it got formed very rapidly. When I was in Loma Linda, one of my professors who believed in evolution, he liked to talk to me for some reason for hours at a time. He talked to me more than he talked to his other professors. So I was asking him, his name is Brian Bull. He's passed away now. But I was asking him, I was like, okay, Dr. Bull, what is the number one reason why you do not believe the Genesis account, why you believe in millions and hundreds of thousands and millions of years for life on this planet? He says, the number one reason for me is the age of the Grand Canyon, and specifically these lava dams that filled up the Grand Canyon, and then it would take hundreds of thousands of years for these lava dams to erode away, and there's no way the Bible can be consistent with that. We know the ages of these lava dams. So I was like, I didn't really know about these lava dams at the time, so I went and started researching them, and the first place I went is to Arizona University, because who would know best besides Arizona University? So I went there, and I looked up these lava dams, and the first paper I found, the title of the paper was called The Baby Grand, right? And it turns out that these lava dams didn't erode away over long periods of time. The lava dams, when the lava flowed into the Grand Canyon and filled it up, it built up a lake behind it. But at the bottom of the lava, when lava hits water, it turns to glass. So when the lava flowed into the Grand Canyon, the bottom of the lava was glass, like obsidian. And so when it filled up the Grand Canyon and it put a giant lake behind it, there's earthquakes in the region. And as the earthquake came, it broke up the bottom glass layer of the lava dam. And the lava dam collapsed within 20 minutes. And it formed this giant 2,000-foot wall of water that came rushing through all of a sudden. And there's these exponential decay curves on the side of the Grand Canyon that you can see now from when the lava came through. The water came through from the collapsed lava dam. And it carved out the western Grand Canyon within hours, not hundreds of thousands of years. And huge gorges and these sharp V-channel canyons that you see in the Grand Canyon, those had to be carved out rapidly. V-channel canyons can't be carved out slowly. These are catastrophic signals. So I went back and showed it to Dr. Bull. I was like, Dr. Bull, few hours. And he never talked to me again about that. So he just moved off to something else. It's like, this Grand Canyon isn't old at all. It could carve very rapidly, right? And the Grand Staircase is even more evidence of rapid. It's a grander canyon than the Grand Canyon. And it got carved even more rapidly. This is the tip of the Grand Canyon, the Grand Staircase. And you can see kind of the end of the V there where the Grand Canyon starts. And you can see the bigger Grand Staircase around it. But that's even bigger rapid erosion. And that happened after the flood. Monument Valley, the same way. You don't get these monuments just sticking up over millions of years. You have to have rapid sheet erosion to create monuments like this in Monument Valley. So after the flood, the water ran off the continents rapidly, made these big canyons off the coasts of the continents, and left these monuments when all the water went away and couldn't wipe them all out in time. All the water disappeared. All these monuments have been sticking out in the middle of nowhere. You can't do that over millions of years. What's interesting, too, is about the animals before and right after the flood. A lot of them were vegetarian, which is much more consistent with the biblical description of how the world started out anyway. More than half of the crocodiles in the fossil record are vegetarian. And you're like, how do we know that? From their teeth, right? They have different teeth. So more than half the crocodile, you ask, well, what did a vegetarian crocodile eat? Were there like tofu beasts? No, it's just like, well, I don't know what they ate, but it could have been like giant watermelons. I have no idea. But they were vegetarian. They went around eating vegetarian stuff. So there were evidently better vegetarian plants back then that could support giant animals like crocodiles before the flood and even maybe right afterward. Because right now we don't have any of the vegetarian crocodiles left. Also, some spiders are completely vegetarian, which is interesting. And some mosquitoes are completely vegetarian. Even the female mosquitoes, or some species, are completely vegetarian. And they're the biggest, prettiest mosquitoes around, and they're vegetarian. They only eat like nectar and plant stuff. So it makes more sense. Isaiah starts to make more sense when it says that lions will eat straw like an ox, And so like, what's interesting about eating straw like an ox is that the vegetarian diet, or how to actually absorb straw like an ox, is much more complex. It requires more stomachs and more enzymes and stuff to break it down and to use it. And so the vegetarian diet is more complex than a meat-eating diet. So a meat-eating diet is degenerative in nature. It's devolutionary. It's not evolutionary. It's going downhill, not uphill. So animals are devolving when they become meat eaters, not evolving. It's less complex to be a meat eater. And same with cavefish losing eyes. That's a downhill. That's a loss of something, not a gain of something. So which came first, the fish with an eye or the fish without the eye? The fish with the eye came first. The fish without the eye came second because it's devolutionary. It's going downhill. And that's what's happening to all of us. We're all going downhill, not uphill. Flightless birds. This is a flightless cormorant. Which came first? The stubby-winged little bird that can't fly? No, the original cormorant that could fly came first, because it's a loss of information to lose the ability to fly. Originally, Adam and Eve were much bigger than we are now. We have devolved a lot since then. According to Ellen White, there were more than twice as tall as men living today. So that's a range between, let's say, 10 feet and 18 feet. Maybe an average back then of around 14 feet. If you think that Adam was 14 feet tall, that's over a ton. He weighed over a ton. His wife weighed 3/4 of a ton. Eve. You really couldn't sneak up on each other. Right? Boom, 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 boom. What's that? Eve, dear, is that you? You know, coming along. I mean, you women have nothing to worry about. Eve weighed 3/4 of a ton, dear. Right? So, and they lived more than 10 times as long. They were also much smarter. They were so smart, they didn't even think of writing books because they never forgot anything. And everybody was right there, 7 generations living at the same time. They could go talk to Adam anytime they wanted and hear the original story for themselves, and they never wrote it down because they never forgot anything, right? So it's a very, very different world back then. Ellen White talks about this. She says, as Adam came forth from the hand of his creator, he was of noble height and beautiful symmetry. He was more than twice as tall as men now living upon the earth, and he was well proportioned. Eve was not quite as tall as Adam. Her head reached a little above his shoulders. She too was noble, perfect in symmetry, and very beautiful. Many flatter themselves that in this enlightened age, men are superior in knowledge and talent to those who lived before the flood. But those who think this do not rightly estimate the physical and mental strength of the long-lived race. In those early ages, growth was slow and firm. Men did not, as at present time, flash into maturity early and quickly exhaust their vital forces. Their minds were of high order and were strong and clear. The antediluvians were without books. They had no written records, but with their great physical and mental vigor, they had strong memories, able to grasp and retain that which was communicated to them, and in turn to transmit it unimpaired to their posterity. And for hundreds of years, there were 7 generations living upon the earth contemporaneously, having the opportunity of consulting together and profiting each other by knowledge and experience of all. So it was a very different world, and they lived hundreds of years, and they were much bigger and stronger and superior in every way. So what happened? So you're like, we're not like that now. What happened? And this is the biggest hang-up for some of the scientists. There's no way the Bible is accurate when it says people lived 900 years and were twice as tall as they are today. That's just crazy. But not if you look at a few things here. First of all, every human being has about 200 mutations that their parents didn't have. Every child is devolving because at least 20 of these mutations are not neutral. And of the ones that are functionally relevant, they're all detrimental. Almost all of them, 1 billion to 1. And so children are inferior to their parents. Sorry, Wesley and Bradley. That's just a fact. Inferior to their parents. You're downhill, boys. So we're devolving, not evolving. And what's also interesting is that prior to the flood, the atmosphere was 3 to 4 times thicker and denser. How do we know this? Because there's these birds, well, pterodactyls, they're not really birds, lizards, flying lizards, with 45-foot wingspan, right? And they were as big as elephants, giant flying lizards, as big as a giraffe, as tall as a giraffe. There's no way those things could fly in today's atmosphere. They had to. The reason why we know the atmosphere had to be 3 or 4 times thicker is that's what it would take to hold one of these things up in the air. So the living in a hyperbaric chamber with also increased oxygen levels is what we use now to heal wounds of people who are sick and who need better wound healing, and they don't have enough oxygen delivery to heal these wounds. And so we put them in hyperbaric chambers with increased oxygen to help them to heal. And if you lived in that situation, where you lived in a hyperbaric chamber, 3 or 4 times the normal atmospheric pressure and higher oxygen levels, you could run all day long and not be weary. You would not have lactic acid buildup. You would cut yourself, and in 20 minutes you would be better. It was a different world before the flood. And living without a hyperbaric chamber, how long it only took about 3 or 4 generations before you went from living 500 to 900 years to living between, 80 to 110 years after the flood. And so it was a rapid decline in the age of how long you could live right after the flood. How do you get such a rapid change if it wasn't like this hyperbaric difference? That would be a sudden difference that the human race experienced before and after the flood, because the atmosphere just collapsed after the flood. And so it also affected human lifespan because we no longer had that hyperbaric advantage after the flood. What's interesting about the hyperbaric thing is if you they put pigs in hyperbaric chambers at 3 atmospheric pressures at 100% oxygen, and they took away all their blood. Without any blood, the pigs could be alive, and their tissues could be maintained. They didn't decay. So in hyperbaric chambers without any blood at 3 atmospheres, you won't die without any circulation, that's very interesting. So it was a different world before the flood. Also, we know the oxygen levels were at least well higher than they are today, at least 35%, based on bubbles trapped in amber that have higher oxygen concentration. So there was a marked increase in plant life also before the flood that would produce this oxygen. Look at all the coal and oil that's buried, the massive seams of coal. The entire planet was warm. There were no ice caps because the atmosphere was really thick. It blocked out, it evenly distributed the heat from the sun. The whole planet was a greenhouse. And so the whole place was covered with plants. And plants produce oxygen, so the oxygen level was much higher than it is today. In fact, if you block out radiation from the sun and you put a hyperbaric type situation, this guy in Tokyo, Japan, Kiyomori, he grew a tomato plant that grew into a tomato tree, 14 feet tall. This was a cherry tomato plant, and it produced baseball-sized cherry tomatoes, 900 at a time, right? And you're like, wow, that's a giant cherry tomato, sweet, really good. You're like, wow, this is a very different world again before the flood than it is now. In fact, David Hilbert thinks he has problems in maintaining his garden. Here's a 2-ton armadillo. Imagine having that in your garden, and you can't really shoot it very well. He's got this armor plating, right? So, and 2-ton armadillo digging around in your garden. We've got 485-pound beavers, and they could chomp down trees with a single bite. On today's trees, these are nothing, right? Giant beavers. Here's a giant beaver. And they had giant sloths. I'm holding a 5-pound sloth here in Brazil, and they had 5-ton sloths before the flood and after the flood. These sloths didn't die out until like 1,000 years ago. We still have remains of them in caves in South America. Giant gorillas, over 10 feet tall. Megalodons, up to 50 feet long. Modern sharks only 20 feet long. You could swallow a whole family for lunch. They were just very different. And the reason why is because I believe this atmospheric pressure thing allowed them to be that big. You have giant dragonflies with wingspans up to 2.5 feet, 7 times bigger. This is the dragonfly. Carry away small children, right? You have 19-inch cockroaches. Like yay big, right? That's a cockroach. Having that in your kitchen, you're like, I need a whole sandwich, right? Sigrid is like scared when you got like a 2-inch. When we went to Florida to visit, Sigrid had never seen insects like that. And she's from, the city in L.A. And I took her to Florida, and we were staying in this hotel, and a 3-inch cockroach came up onto our dresser when she pulled it out to get the clothes out. And I thought she was going to die. Just imagine a 19-inch cockroach. They had 8-foot millipedes. These are millipedes that can kill dinosaurs. right? An 8-foot millipede. I can't imagine if you thought a 19-inch cockroach was bad. Also, right after the flood, there were a lot of different animals that no longer exist in North America. These are the North American extinct animals, including camels and zebra-type animals and lions and saber-toothed cats and bears, giant sloths. Even right after the flood, this was a very different world. You got bears that are taller than elephants. You've got pigs that are taller than people. David Hillebert again thinks he has problems with his pigs. No, imagine running into one of these things. These are called Megaloceros or Paratelodon or Diadodon. They were huge right after the flood. They had monster snakes, Titanoboa. This is a Smithsonian exhibit of a Titanoboa. They were giant creatures because of the different situation before the flood. So why do we still have evidence of these things? Because the flood wiped out pretty much, it's hard to find any remains of human being that lived before the flood. The giants that lived before the flood, we don't have those. Ellen White says they were buried under mountain ranges. It's the reason why we don't have them. But we have other evidences to at least give us the edge, like David told in the children's story, to give us a basis of rational faith. We don't have like absolute evidence, but we have enough, I dare say, more than enough, to conclude that the Bible story is accurate and that God knew what he was talking about. He's not lying to us. He's not trying to deceive us. He's given the best information that's available. She says, soon after the flood, the race began to rapidly decrease in size and in length of years. Why? Well, there's a bunch of reasons why, possibly. There was a class of very large animals which persisted at the flood. God knew that the strength of man would decrease, and these mammoth animals would not be controlled by feeble man, so they died off. God so ordered that men, beasts, and trees many times larger than those now upon the earth, and other things should be buried in the earth at the time of the flood, and there should be preserved to evidence to man that the inhabitants of the old world perished by a flood. God designed that the discovery of these things in the earth should establish faith of men in the inspired history. So if you just look a little bit out of it, also if you just look at the different scientists that talk about it, they disagree. They don't talk to each other. The one scientist that talk about the warm period don't talk about the other scientists who do ice core dating and all these different things. They disagree with each other in literature. And that's like, don't you read each other what you write? And they don't talk about that. And so if you just put two and two together, you're like, man, the Bible was right on. Right? It all makes sense from a biblical perspective. And so for me, it just gives me much more confidence that not just the physical claims of the Bible where it talks about ancient history, if that's correct, then you can say, I also think that the Bible probably knows what it's talking about when it says metaphysical things that I can't prove, like, was Mary really a virgin? Was Jesus really born of a virgin? Did he really suffer on the cross for my sins personally? Right? All these metaphysical things, that's like, if the Bible's correct about everything else, I think it's correct about that too. And when he says that he's making a place for me, that he's going to come again, well, he was right about everything else. The prophecies have been all right. All the physical claims of the Bible are right. So I really believe that the rest of it's right too, that he really is making a place for me. He really did die on a cross for me, and he really does love me, and he's really coming back again. So it just gives credibility to the Bible, everything in the Bible, because of these physical things that we see even in the fossil record. It all makes sense. So thank you guys.